Hey there, designer friends, and welcome to this chapter on key design principles. I want to start off by laying the ground foundations in which we're going to build all the other chapters and skills in this program, because I think it's very, very important that we all speak in the same language and we all have kind of the same frameworks and mental models to think through everything that we learn later on. So what I'm going to cover in this chapter is, first of all, what is design? Understanding and coming up with definitions that's going to help us think together about what we need to do and how to do great design. Then the other thing that I'm going to cover is I'm going to talk about design thinking and the process of design convergence and how these things come into play in everything that we are going to design later on. So let's get started in talking about what is design. So if we would go into the dictionary and look at what they would define design as, it would say something like a plan or a drawing produced to show the look and function of a building or a garment or any other object. Now, this is not really helpful because what does that mean? Is it just like the wireframe is the design? Like what is this? And the other definition might be something like the arrangement of lines created to form a pattern or a decoration. This is even worse, right? This is just like design is making things pretty, and we know that that is not the case. So these kinds of definitions are really not helpful for us, right? It doesn't let us know what we're trying to do here. Now, some of people refer to the famous Steve Jobs quote as kind of a definition of what is design, right? So he said design is not just what it looks and feels like, design is how it works. And while this is true, this is also doesn't really help me as a designer understand how to go about design. So what do I have to do right now? How do I know how to make this work and look and feel? So I've actually come across a definition, so this is not really helpful. I've come across a definition that I actually like, and I want to share that with you. It's from a designer. She's not famous, I think, but her name is Kim, and I read this on a Medium article, and I think this is helpful. So she said, I used to think that the purpose of design was to make everything beautiful, but it turns out that's not really true. The purpose of design is much more closely linked to strategy than aesthetics. Design is the process of intentionally creating something while simultaneously considering its objective, what's its purpose, its function, economics, sociocultural factors, and aesthetics. Sometimes design is ugly intentionally, and sometimes it's beautiful. But when it's done well, it's always on purpose. Now, I think this is very true. However, that's a lot to digest, and I want to think about a simple way to share this with you so it can actually be practical for you. So the way that I think about this is design is actually solving a problem. So as Kim said, design always have a purpose, right? And what is the purpose? The purpose is to solve some kind of a problem. And it can be very, very diverse type of problems, from how do you get users to do something to how to design a chair or a furniture or a building or whatnot. It always has a purpose, which is to solve a problem for somebody. Now, the reason that I think this definition is very, very helpful is because it helps us understand that if this is the definition, right, we have a problem and the design will be the solution of that problem, that really helps me think about what I need to do next as a designer. So the first thing that I need to understand is, what is actually the problem, right? I think many designers just get kind of a brief, or a client tells them, hey, I need to do this, and they just run off to actually design this thing. But if they don't really understand what is the problem, what they're actually trying to solve with this thing, then actually they're not doing a design. Maybe they're decorating, or maybe they're creating something, but it's not a design. It's not designing a solution to a problem if they don't understand what is the problem. Now, the second thing that this definition helps us to understand is that if we're solving a problem, who are we solving that problem to? Because even if the problem is similar, different people might need different solutions for the problem, right? So let me give you an example, right? I have this bottle of water here, right? So if the problem is, how do we create some kind of a container to help people drink from, right? So if I have to design this bottle for babies, then obviously this solution is not a good solution. It's too heavy. They can't open this thing. So this is a very bad solution. However, if this is a solution, if this is the problem is design a bottle of water for designers who like epic drinks and they like black and white, so this would be very appealing to them. So a key component of solving a problem with using design is understanding who are we solving this for. And now the last component of understanding a design is that solving a problem is never done in kind of like an empty space. There are always constraints to solving a problem. And those constraints can be budget. Like we can't spend like $10,000 on a bottle, right? People won't pay that. So we have to find a way to manufacture it in a reasonable price, right? And we have to have this ready, by next year. Otherwise, we're going to run out of money and going to go bankrupt. So there's always limitations and constraints about the project that we're going to do with our design. If there's no constraints at all, it's probably not a design project. It's probably maybe an art project. But real world design projects always have constraints. They can be money, they can be time, and sometimes they can be other things that are just like you can't change them. Sometimes that's like the legal landscape, right? We have to include this thing for legal reasons, or we have to do this thing because the boss won't change their mind or whatever. There's always kind of like things or constraints that you have to work with. So to sum up this definition of design, I think it's very, very helpful to think about design as solving a problem, because you will understand that you need to understand what is the problem, who are we solving this for, who will need to use the solution, and what are the constraints that we have when we come up with ideas for the solution. So that being said, let's think about how do we actually solve design problems. And I want to talk about two different kind of frameworks for thinking about this. One of them is called design thinking, and the other one is design convergence or convergent divergent thinking. And then how we kind of overlay these processes together to come up with the way that we work to solve design problems. So let's start with design thinking. Design thinking is basically kind of an iterative process to design anything. And the assumptions are this. So the first assumption is when we go to solve a problem, we don't really know what the real problem is. Okay, that is the kind of key assumption here. And so the first step of design thinking means we have to empathize with the people that we're trying to solve for so that we can really learn what their problem is, what are they struggling with, and what are their constraints are, so that we can really come up with a good solution for them. So again, if we would want to design a solution for babies for drinking bottled or whatever, then we'll probably have to sit next to babies and learn about them and see, all right, this is too heavy for you, this is a material that you don't like touching. You have to empathize with them, right? Show empathy, see how they react to things so that you can learn to them about them and how they would probably react to your solutions. If you need to design a website for accountants, you might want to spend time with accountants to learn how they behave, what they like, what they hate, so that you can really come up with a good definition of the problem and your constraints, so that you will be able to design a solution for them. So step number one is to empathize and learn as much as you can about the problem and about the people that we're solving for. Now, the next step in the process is to actually define the problem, right? Because when you're empathizing and spending time with people and learning about the project and doing research, you'll find a lot of problems and a lot of constraints. And probably you're not going to be able to tackle them all in the one project that you're trying to do. So it's very, very important to make a definition of what you're trying to solve for right now. What are the priorities and what are the things that you actually want to focus on? And it's probably going to be one or two things that you're trying to solve for, right? You can't solve, all of the world's problem with one website or one brand identity or one product. So you have to make a definition of, here are the things that I'm going to try and learn for. Once we have that definition, we move into a stage that is called ideation. And sometimes that stage, you've probably heard about it in terms of brainstorm or something like that. Basically, that means the assumption here is that for every problem, there's not just one solution. All right, there's always multiple possible solutions to each problem. And so we have to spend time to come up with a lot of different ideas so that we can understand what is the best solution. All right. So again, the assumption is there's not only one solution, and it's probably not going to be the first solution that you'll think about. So you have to spend time coming up with multiple options so that you'll be able to choose from them. So that is the ideation step. And then the next step after that is saying, all right, here's the idea that we're going to go with. Let's prototype it. And the idea behind prototyping means, because we're not sure this is the good solution, let's see if we can build kind of like a first version without spending too much money or too much time on it, just so we can move into the next step, which is testing it, showing this solution to the people that, we're going to launch this to, see that it actually solved their problem, and then moving on. And that's why this process is always in iteration, because the assumption here is that every solution is actually just an experiment, right? And you'll have to put it into the world and let people use it so that you can learn whether this works and start this cycle all over again. Now, if you think about something like, let's say, the iPhone, right? So Apple does this circle, this design thinking process. They will create some kind of a prototype. They'll test it. They'll probably, do some beta testing. They'll do some focus group. They'll let people use it, employees, and then they will make this, and then they will make a decision whether they need to go through another round because the results weren't so good, or they can kind of relaunch it. But even when they relaunch it, even when it's not just a prototype, right? It's the iPhone itself and it's being launched, or it's the website that you've been working on and it's fully launched into the air. The assumption of design thinking is that this is still a test, right? You think you've figured it out, but now you've really put this into the world, and now you're going to have to start the cycle again and start empathizing with people and realize what's their problem right now. So design is never really finished. It's always going through this cycle of putting something in the world and then empathizing with people, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, learning about the new problems that were created because of this solution, and then coming up with ideas to solve this again and again. And the deadline, right, for when we have to test or launch is based on our budget and on our time. But we're always going to have a next version. We're never going to have like the perfect design. That's why we always have a new iPhone. That's why every website eventually is going to be redesigned, because the world changes and no solution stays 100% perfect forever. So that's the design thinking process. Now, just for you to kind of know and expand your horizons, this process was popularized by David Kelly. He's the founder of IDEO. IDEO is kind of like a very, very famous design agency. If you're not familiar with them, I would Google them and go learn about them a little bit. They are the design agency that actually worked with Apple back in the 80s before Apple had an amazing product designers of their own. They are the one who kind of invented the mouse for Apple, or designed the mouse for Apple. So they're very famous, and David Kelly, he's the one who popularized it. He didn't invent it, but he made it popular. I would spend a little bit of time going through their website and learning about them. Super, super interesting company. All right, the next concept I want to talk about is design convergence. Now, here's the assumption here. Every time that you have a problem, and we've mentioned this in a minute ago, there's not only one solution. There's no straight line, and there's one solution for this idea. So we always have to kind of come up with many ideas. We talked about this in the ideation stage of design thinking, so that we have multiple ideas to pick from, and then we'll choose. So the idea here with design divergence is throughout this process, there's actually two types of thinking here, right? And they're using different parts of the brain, actually. So you might have heard that we have kind of a left part of the brain and the right part of the brain. The left part is more analytical. That's where the language is, and all the kind of like mathematical functions are in the left side of the brain. And then the right side of the brain is kind of like the more creative side of the brain, right? That's where drawing and art and music and all of that kind of thing. So when we're doing this process, we're actually going to use different parts of our brain. So in the first part, which is called divergent thinking, the purpose is to just come up with as many ideas as possible. This is the creative right side of the brain function, where we just need to come up with as many ideas as possible. We're not trying to come up with a good idea, with just as many options as possible. So we just want quantity and a lot of ideas. And then at some point, we have to switch. We have to say, okay, we've got a bunch of ideas. Now we need to pick only one or two to move forward with, because as I've mentioned, right, at the end of the day, we need to launch one thing. We can't launch multiple things. And even when you're thinking about something like A/B testing or Apple launching the iPhone in multiple colors, at the end of the day, they've settled for one or two options out of the infinite amount of options. And so to narrow down between all of the infinite options that you have to use a different type of thinking, which is the convergent type of thinking, which is more analytical. Now you have to consider and actually analyze, all right, so here are all the options. Which one would best solve the problem, would be most appropriate for our audience, would be, most feasible, most economical? So that's a completely different type of thinking. Now, I think this is important because we're going to go through this opening of multiple options and then converging into one option so many times throughout every design project that it's really important for you to know this process and understand where do you need to be right now. Do you need to come up with as many options as possible, or you need to be choosing one option to consolidate and move forward with it? So that's the idea of design convergence. Now, let me show you some ideas of how they actually overlay on top of each other. So in the design thinking process, we've mentioned we start with empathizing, and then the next step is to define the problem. So when we are in the empathize step, we're in the divergent type of thinking. We're just collecting a lot of information, a lot of different problems, a lot of different data points. And then when we make the definition, that is by definition converging into one problem that we want to focus on. And then once we have that one problem that we want to focus on, then again, that becomes the problem. And then we move into the ideation stage, which is again, divergence. Now let's explore all the options to select to solve this problem. And then we're going to have to converge into the one solution that we want to prototype. So as you can see, these things happen on top of one another. And I want to show you some kind of like practical examples from real life of how this happens. So in the web design process, right? What does a web design process looks like? We start with strategy, right? We want to understand, we start with discovery. We want to understand who are our clients, what are their problems, and then we collect all of these problems, and then we decide, all right, here's the strategy. This is the one thing that we want to solve for in this project, and then we move into content development and wireframing, and then doing the visual design and the development. So if we look at those different frameworks that we talked about, then you can actually see that between each of these milestones, right, in the discovery, we're collecting a lot of information. The strategy will be the convergent into here is the one thing, or here are the main goals that we want to focus on with this website. And then we're going to open up to all of the different content options. So maybe we'll do a blog, and maybe we'll do this, and maybe we'll need this page. So we'll come up with a lot of options, and then we'll consolidate and say, all right, here's the pages that we need. Now let's come up with wireframes. So again, we're going to diverge. Here are multiple layouts that we can use for wireframes. We're going to test out different options, and then we're going to decide, okay, here's the wireframe. This is the design that we're going to go with. Let's move into the visual design, and then again, open up. Let's try this color. Let's try this font. So as you can see, we're always opening up and closing, opening up and closing, and moving between the divergent and convergent types of thinking. Now, if you want to look at it from the design thinking perspective, you can also see that, in the discovery phase is actually the empathizing, right? We spend time with the clients. We're trying to understand their problems. And then the strategy is actually the definition. All right, so what are the things that we're going to solve for? And then all the wireframing and the visual design is actually the ideation and even the start of the prototype. The development is the prototype, and launching the project will actually be testing, putting it out there in the world to see if this actually solves the problem. Now, even within each step, again, these things happen again and again. Let me take an example from the logo design process. So initially, when we design a logo, we would start by exploring a lot of different ideas, right? Hey, let's try like 3 lines, and let's try this different idea, and let's try a sun, let's try this. So you want to come up, again, divergent type of thinking. You're coming up with a lot of different ideas. And then you're going to converge. You're going to say, okay, I'm going to go with this concept of like 3 lines below the logo. All right. So then once you've converged into one option, now you're going to explore that again. Okay, so let's try different fonts for this one option that we choose. So we're going to open up again all the possibilities in fonts. And then we're going to diverge into one font that we picked. And then we're going to open up with a different factor. All right, let's test, How many lines do we have? Are they thin? Are they thick? Do we have 3 lines? Do we have 5 lines? So throughout the process, we're going to open up and close so many times. And we can actually do this forever. The only limit that we have for it is, as I mentioned before, is we probably have a deadline and a budget. And that's going to limit the amount of opening up and closing that we can go throughout the project. Otherwise, we can go in depth. And that's actually what makes, expensive projects better, because you have more time to go through these iteration of divergent convergence and hopefully get into a more refined solution. All right, so let me sum up what we've discussed in this chapter and why it actually matters, right? So the first thing that we started with was the definition that design is actually solving a problem. And I think that this is very helpful, because now you know, when you remember this, that you can't really design if you don't understand the problem. Now, because you also understand the design thinking process, you also know that you can't decide on a problem before you've spent some time empathizing with the people that you're trying to solve for, so that you can make sure that the definition of the problem that you're trying to solve is actually correct. A lot of times client would come to you, they think they know what the problem is, but to be honest, they don't really know what the problem is. And you have to spend time empathizing to really define what the problem is. And you understand that now that you understand the design thinking process. So, and the next thing, because you understand the divergent convergent type of thinking, you understand there's never just one solution to a problem. There's probably going to be infinite amount of possibilities. You need to explore at least some of them before you make a decision to move forward with just one solution to a specific problem. And the last thing that I want you to remember is everything that we design is eventually a test, right? It's hypothesis that out of the infinite amount of possible solution, this one will work the best. But to be honest, we never have the 100% confidence. Nobody has. And you have to remember it, even when you launch a project that you worked on for a lot of time and you got paid a lot of money, at the end of the day, this is a test. And we're going to have to follow up, or the clients or whoever owns the project is going to have to follow up in due time, see if it did perform well or not, and then start this round of iteration all over again. So that's design. Thank you for watching this chapter.